I first met Gustavo Gutierrez in the early 1980s at Maryknoll, where I landed my first teaching job. Soon after I arrived, two Maryknoll sisters were brutally murdered in El Salvador. The Catholic missionary world was new to me, and for a Jew, quite strange. As I entered Maryknoll, my introduction to liberation theology in its Christian form through martyrdom had begun. It happened like this. As an undergraduate, I studied with the Holocaust theologian Richard Rubinstein. His dire understanding of history gleaned from the Holocaust, history as a cycle of violence and atrocity without end, unnerved me. During this time, I had an intense encounter with Daniel Berrigan and also with Dorothy Day. These disparate encounters led me to spend a year at the Catholic Worker, working and living among the poor. The diary I wrote during that year was published as a book through which a Maryknoll missionary who had spent years in Bolivia discovered me. When I received his aerogram, postmarked from Saudi Arabia, where Maryknoll was setting up a dialogue with Islam, I was intrigued by his story among the poor of Bolivia and his understanding of my journey among the poor of New York City. This was the beginning of my journey to Maryknoll and to their mission sites around the world. Suddenly, I was immersed in the transgressive and transformative world of liberation theology. As a Jew, what was I to think about this missionary world turned upside down? My early meetings with Gustavo and other liberation theologians, Sergio Torres, Pablo Richard, and Otto Maduro among them, was an eye-opener for me. It was also an eye-opener for them. What was a Jew doing teaching at Maryknoll? So the journey began. For my 1988 summer session, I proposed celebrating Gustavo's 60th birthday with a gathering of liberation theologians from around the world. From this gathering, the first Festschrift honoring Gustavo emerged of 50 essays, almost 500 small type pages with the title, The Future of Liberation Theology, Essays in Honor of Gustavo Gutierrez. I met with Gustavo many times during the planning for the summer session. I was young and fresh to the Catholic scene, and I was directing a program far more controversial than I understood at the time. Times were changing within the Catholic Church. Liberation theology, still insurgent, had become a controversial political force. The Church under John Paul II cracked down. Leonardo Boff, Gustavo, and Maryknoll were on the Church's radar. Gustavo, ever a church player, wanted to know who was invited to our summer session, who had accepted to come and write, which bishops had said no, which bishops had said yes. The Vatican was involved. Maryknoll's Superior General was called to Rome. My Jewish life intersected with Gustavo's liberation themes in many ways. While I traveled the world with Maryknoll, I was also coming home, Jewishly. I had traveled to Israel in 1973. I returned in 1984 and beyond. Something had gone wrong with the Jewish world. We Jews, often the oppressed, had become, in relation to the Palestinian people, the oppressors. Catholic liberation theology features the Jewish prophetic as the lever to free Jesus from the captivity of the church. I asked if the Jewish prophetic, our indigenous, had become captive to Jewish empowerment in Israel. As I developed the Jewish theology of liberation, Gustavo was thinking through and writing his deepest theological grappling on Job, God talk and the suffering of the innocent. In this book, absent was the bravado of early liberation theology, knowing that God, with our activity, would lift the poor out of being non-persons in an unjust world. I asked another question. Now lifted out of our oppression, had our newfound power as Jews liberated, or enslaved us. Gustavo and I discussed these issues. Our timing was in sync. Gustavo published On Job in Peru in 1985, the same year I published my first article on a Jewish theology of liberation. Gustavo wrote the preface for the third edition of my Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. It was 2004, and the verdict on the central premise of a Jewish theology of liberation, that only with justice for Palestinians can Jews become liberated, wasn't going to happen. The Jewish prophetic was on the run. This because the Israeli occupation of Palestine, with the enablement of Constantinian and progressive Jews in America and elsewhere, had become permanent. Jews of conscience, already in exile, were now fated to permanent exile. The equation is obvious. Permanent occupation, permanent exile. Looking back, Gustavo's On Job, while strong in its commitment and struggle against a still Constantinian church, is already a sign of retreat, of defeat. In On Job, God's ways are a mystery and God's gratuitous love remains, but the call to arms, Jesus among the poor, has lost its victorious edge. Though I came at a Jewish theology of liberation from the perspective of the Holocaust and the newfound Jewish power in Israel and America, if one reads my writing carefully, a Jewish theology of liberation is counterintuitively already an act of mourning. A Jewish theology of liberation is written at the end of ethical Jewish history. On Job charts a way of life for those on the path of struggle hoping to achieve what won't be achieved. On Job is about Gustavo laying the groundwork for what I later called practicing exile. Gustavo and other Christian liberationists who already affirmed God had to rethink, or rather reconfigure, their certainty. A Jewish theology of liberation, unable to embrace God after the Holocaust, in the permanence of exile, had to rethink, or rather reconfigure, this certainty. For can a Jew survive permanent exile without God? Fortunately for Jews, the prophetic and exile represent our Jewish indigenous homecoming. Beyond the Christian bravado found in parts of Christian liberation theology, Christians linked with and searching for their Jewish roots have this homecoming as well. Years ago, life was so busy and often troubled that I didn't always take the time to relish significant moments in my life. Some days ago, I reread Gustavo's beautiful preface to the third edition of Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, and I wrote in my journal, quote, "Today I continue to write my presentation in honor of Gustavo's pioneering work in liberation theology, which unbeknownst to him at the time, though a clarion call for justice, was charting a way for Christians to practice the prophetic in exile in a world that would continue on its way. I thought of my work on a Jewish theology of liberation in a similar way, which unbeknownst to me at the time, though a clarion call for justice, was charting a path for Jews to practice the prophetic in exile in a world that would continue on its way." End of quote. Whither Jews at the end of ethical Jewish history? Jews cannot go back behind empowerment. We cannot go ahead by oppressing another people, the Palestinian people. Constantinian Judaism, with progressive Jews as their left wing, has triumphed. The exile of Jews of conscience is permanent. With other exiles from around the world, Jews of conscience live. What is this life with other people of conscience to be? In this new final exile, what will Jewish become. The future arrives as I speak. Since the publication of Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation in 1987, there have been attempts to refine and broaden its scope. I have participated in that refining and broadening. I have also learned from others. But the danger signs are here as well. By emphasizing Jewish diasporism and decolonial Jewish, the danger is diminishing Jewish. The Jewish prophetic thrives in its strength and partly in its contradictions, not in weakness. Jewish particularity within the cauldron of Holocaust in Israel cannot be left behind or deflected in broad assertions of anti-Zionism and colonialism. To my mind, these are two easy ways out of Jewish history as it was and as it will be. The Jewish prophetic is energized and bold in its confrontation with power. The Jewish prophetic came home within the Holocaust and Israeli power. All Jewishness today revolves around Holocaust in Israel, even and especially among dissenters. Ambivalence toward Jews around the world remains. Within Christianity and Islam and modernity, it flourishes. How many Christians and Muslims of conscience who support Jews and Palestinians shy away from being closely associated with Jews of conscience? In my experience, the answer is many, perhaps all. To me, this shying away means that Palestinians are symbolic markers rather than real subjects. It also means that Jews are symbolic markers rather than real subjects. Fear for career triumphs. The consequences of this, the isolation of Jews of conscience, and those who shy away from Jews of conscience, you diminish your own witness. I ask, are well-intentioned Christian academics, through their silence and fear, enablers of the destruction of Palestine and enablers of the end of ethical Jewish history? This is what I have called for decades the interfaith ecumenical deal, where Christians repent for the history of Christian anti-Semitism, which they should, and remain silent about Palestine, which they shouldn't, so as not to be labeled anti-Semitic. Now there is more speech about the oppression of Palestinians, but usually at a safe distance, accepting me and a few other Jews to speak directly about this, again at a distance. So it goes. The struggle to be faithful as a Jew demands boldness and a willingness to sacrifice for an end which is unknown at the end of ethical Jewish history.